So let's talk about trim runaway. So one of the most famous accidents in the last 12 months was TN Girl. She had that popular YouTube channel. And Bonanza is a little bit more known for this because the Bonanza autopilot uses the trim system to hold altitude in it. And a Bonanza, I'll show you here, has these big trim tabs, but not just on one control surface, but on both control surfaces. Now the autopilot is controlling these trim tabs. But what happens here is people are engaging their autopilot before the aircraft is in its straight and level flight configuration. So instead of getting the aircraft at your altitude, leveling it off, let your airspeed build up, you're trimming out some of that pressure so the yoke is staying at one position, the aircraft's holding its altitude, then you engage your altitude hold on your autopilot and engage the autopilot. When you don't do that, there's two different ways to trim this aircraft. You can trim it with electronic on your yoke, and when you don't have that, you have a little wheel that you spin, trim up and trim down. And when you engage that autopilot, it is trying to control that cable for the trim and it's putting pressure on it. And the difference between where you have the aircraft trimmed out at to where the autopilot's trying to trim it out at creates a lot of pressure. So when the autopilot is disengaged, the airplane is going to go back into wherever you had it manually trimmed out to. So if you had it trimmed out to a nose down attitude, when you disengage the autopilot, or the autopilot builds up so much pressure, it just says, hey, this is beyond my limits, and it shuts itself off, the aircraft's going to go into a nosedive. So it's going to return to its manual trim state, whether that be nose up or nose down. But the problem is with some of these autopilots, especially in the Bonanzas, it will flash a sign, trim up, and you're trimming it up. And then if you're not understanding exactly how that autopilot works, you could over trim to maximum trim up. The autopilot is trying to fight that, and then when it kicks off, it goes instantly up, nose up attitude, and it goes into a stall. Or like Tennessee Girl, she had it trimmed so far down that when the autopilot just kicked off, it went into a nose down attitude. Well, here's the problem. When you get high airspeed over that airfoil and it's trimmed to an excessive amount of trim, the amount of pressure that it takes to override that is tremendous. Like in the state with the Tennessee Girl, she had a completely trimmed nose down attitude, complete trim nose down. When it instantly trims down and you instantly increase that airspeed, it instantly increases the amount of pressure on that control surface, which takes tons of pressure. It's said that in some Bonanzas, or in a Bonanza aircraft, especially V-tails, the amount of pressure it would take to pull back on that yoke is somewhere around 800 pounds. And most human beings can't do that with their hands alone. So if you find yourself in this situation, you're going to want to grab the controls, but instantly grab that trim wheel and start putting your trim input. If it's the nose down, then trim up, and if it's the trim up, then trim down as fast as you can to get that pressure off that control surface. The faster that aircraft goes, the more pressure is put on that control surface. Why is this happening? Well, it's happening because these autopilots use the trim to perform an altitude hold on these aircraft. And Bonanzas aren't the only ones. Cirruses do it, other aircraft do it as well. Most of the time they have a bridle cable on the actual elevator control cable, and you have a servo which has a clutch on it, which allows you to override it, allows the pilot to override it. But even in Cirruses will build up pressure between the trim and the autopilot, and when that autopilot just disengages, I've had Cirruses while we're just flying along just automatically pull straight up or go straight down. Most of the time they go straight up, and you got to grab the yoke and override it. And it's pretty easily overridden in the Cirrus. And then you trim, regain control of the aircraft, and think, oh shit, you know, it was kind of puckered your butt. But in Bonanzas, they have such humongous control surface for trim that it puts so much pressure on it, it's almost physically impossible to override that trim without manually trimming it in the opposite direction of whatever you're doing, whether it's in a heavy climb and you're going to a stall, or a nosedive. Nosedives are really dangerous because your airspeed increases so fast that the amount of pressure that's put on that flight control surface is almost, you almost can't overcome it, if not overcomeable. Now we just lost another doctor because of this. What can be done? Well, limit the amount of trim that you can physically input on this aircraft. You only need X amount of trim, and you don't need a trim that will produce a more than 17-degree angle of descent or 17-degree angle of climb. And these Bonanzas way overdo that. I mean, they're way past that. So, and their control surface is so huge, it's phenomenal. So people brush up on your trim, how it's used, and how you can override it very quickly. And you might want to practice this a little bit, but don't do it do it in a safe manner. You don't want to do heavy trim runaway. Bonanzas are really a complicated trim system. When you run into problems with them, it's phenomenal how difficult it is to actually diagnose it properly, because they have relays in there, they have a trim servo in there, then they have a trim amplifier servo control box in there. You got multiple wires that run through that yoke that are very small and fragile and can break very easily. You have a trim switch that is very complex. It does two things when you push that trim. One, it disengages your autopilot, and then it engages your trim servo. So it does two different things, and there's two switches that control that. So it's a pretty complicated system in the Bonanzas, more so than most other aircraft like Pipers and Cessnas and Cirruses and stuff like that. So know your aircraft, people. Learn your airplane, and if you're having problems with an autopilot, don't use it, and limit your IMC flight when there's problems like that, or you're experiencing problems, or that you're not 100% confident in using an autopilot. Then keep the autopilot off until you fully understand its operation and what your procedures should be, and how to override and overcome a trim runaway. Well, I hope this helps you guys out. I love you guys a lot. Fly safe, all right? Take care, guys. Bye.